Today we're going to be fixing a blue original Xbox controller. It has a bad cord. I've already tested it and it worked really well, as my little blue tape suggests. The cord causes it to disconnect during play, and that's not acceptable. We're just going to be replacing the cord. I have an extra one, so let's get into it. I could just find the bad part of this cord, cut it off just like this, and then splice it together, wrap some electrical tape around it. I just don't really like that method. I'd like to go to the main components and replace it there so that it looks original. I think that looks a lot more professional in the end, and that's the look I'm going for, is the original replacement. So we're just going to open up the housing here, remove all the screws. As you'll notice in a second here, it won't open. You remove the first 6 screws, well, there's a 7th underneath this little label here. Now you can get access to that no problem by using a hobby knife, just prying up on one of the corners of the small little label there, and then just peel it back without damaging it. This could be reinstalled later, and it looks like it's brand new when you're done. So there's a total of 7 screws on an original Xbox S controller. I'm not sure about the Dukes, but on the S there's 7. Here I am just removing the old wiring harness pieces. This is the new one that I'm going to be installing. I had this as a spare. Off camera, I already stripped all the wires and pre-tinned them so that they can be installed directly into this controller. Now I just need to go through and strip off all the insulation from these wires and tin these up. The easiest way to do this would probably be to desolder the main component that's attached to the circuit board. I just happen to have an extra Xbox controller cord that was in good shape that unfortunately was cut out instead of desoldered. So get all those nice and tinned. And this is what the final product looks like before it's installed. And we're also going to be using some heat shrink tubing to cover up all the connections to make sure that there's no shorts. Here I'm just taking out the last section of heat shrink on that back end of the cord just to give me a little extra working space. I have a larger section that I'm just going to slide on, and then I'll shrink it down after I'm done with everything. Then I can use the smaller heat shrink tubing for each of the individual wire connections. Now in this next section, you can't really see what I'm doing here, but essentially I'm making little hooks with the wires, attaching them, adding in a little bit of solder, and then putting the heat shrink tubing over the top of it. But in the case of this one, the heat shrink tubing got a little bit close to where I was soldering, and of course it shrunk, and now I can't get it down. So I just shrunk it in place and then found a little piece of patch that I can throw in there, and then just shrunk that down over top of all the other connections. I'm just using my soldering iron tip as a way to heat this up and shrink it, but you can also use a lighter if you have the room. And I nicked myself with the soldering iron. That's going to feel good later. Now I'm just going to go through and finish out all the rest of the wires, connecting them up per each color, making sure that they are connected properly and the heat shrink tubing goes over the top nicely. Just tug on it a little bit, make sure that it is tight. And then that final little heat shrink piece that I had cut off in the beginning, I just wanted to reinstall that. So then it keeps the bundle nice and tight and stuck to the board properly. Then as you can see, they all look nice and tight and bundled up. Then we're just going to move the cable in place, pushing on the cord a little bit just to make sure that it is tensioned in the proper direction. This cord hasn't been installed in a controller in a long while, and making sure that it will fit properly into this new section is pretty important. So there's no extra tension on the wires, pulling them in the wrong direction, potentially where the housing wouldn't fit together properly. Now I'm just reinstalling that main screw, which really keeps the housing together, to test it, and then pushing that label back down so it's in its proper place. And it doesn't even look like it was moved. Doing the final assembly and doing a little tug on the controller cable itself to make sure that it isn't moving at all, that it is in the right position. Then just testing the buttons to make sure everything looks good. Thumbsticks feel good, the D-pad does, all the face buttons do, so do the triggers. So now We just got to test it. I have it all hooked up to a Xbox console to test. As you can see there, it is the same controller. I have a quick disconnect added. And the only real way to test any controller is to use Halo as your testing game. There's no other way to do it. But it is looking pretty promising because the D-pad and the thumbstick are both moving around the menus nicely. But once we load up the game, we'll be able to tell pretty much immediately if there are any issues with the controller that we'll have to revisit. At last indeed. Controller's working great. All the buttons seem like they're working really well. The thumbsticks work really well. Secondary functions on the thumbsticks work. Just to show you that I'm not swapping everything, I want to show you on camera that yes, you can jump, you can reload, swap weapons, shoot. Everything appears to be working properly, even the vibration functions. And just to show you, I'll put it down on the counter here and you'll hear that little bit of vibration right there. Thanks for watching. See you next fix.